Hello and welcome to a History Film Forum discussion of the new and remarkable film Summer of Soul, directed by Questlove, that tells the story of the 1969 Harlem Cultural Festival. I am Chris Wilson, Director of Experience Design at the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian Institution. I would like to thank Searchlight Pictures for providing this film for us, our partners at Smithsonian Associates, and also say that History Film Forum programs are brought to you through the generosity of Dan Manat and Democracy Films. History Film Forum looks at film as public history, history on the screen, and recognizes that so many people learn about their history through the moving images, through film, through television, nowadays through internet video. And there's no better example of that fact than this film, Summer of Soul. This story was really lost to history. The footage hasn't been seen for 50 years from this remarkable collection of artists at the Harlem Cultural Festival and of the audiences who came from the Harlem community to participate in this celebration of African American art. Through breathtaking images and fabulous storytelling, Summer of Soul brings back that history for all of us. Please now join us in a conversation with the director of the film, Ahmir Questlove Thompson, producers Joseph Patel and David Dinerstein, and moderator Fath Davis Ruffins, curator at the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian Institution. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Fath Davis Ruffins, and I'm a curator at the National Museum of American History in a division called Cultural and Community Life. And today, we're interviewing people who worked on, produced, and directed the Summer of Soul film that I hope everyone in the audience has a chance to see. First, I'm going to ask each person to introduce themselves. Let's start with David.
Hi, thank you for having us. My name is David Dinerstein. I am one of the producers of Summer of Soul.
And Joseph.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Joseph Patel. I am a producer on Summer of Soul, or When the Revolution Could Not Be Televised.
And last but not least, Ahmir.
Hey, how you doing? I'm Questlove. I am the director of Summer of Soul, and I'm an Aquarius.
Well, this is a remarkable film that we're welcoming to the museum's History Film Forum. And this film is a particularly creative example of a film that is filled with entertainment, filled with music, filled with excitement, but also documents a cultural moment in the history of African Americans and the history of the nation. Why don't we start out with having people talk about what their role was on the film. So Ahmir, if you can talk about your role as the director for the film.
Yeah, well, I guess the myth of the story is I was approached by David Dinerstein and Robert Fyvolent about this mythical festival in Harlem. And, as someone who grew up around music, I produce and I play music as well, teach at NYU and all that stuff. Like, I haven't heard of any of this. So at the beginning, I really wasn't fully 100% convinced of his existence, but I'll just say that when I saw that what was before me, this 40 hours worth of footage, I was totally mind blown, and I had to be involved. And this is my first time directing, but I think at the end of the day, it's about crafting a really good, compelling story that touches all people, not just music buffs or history buffs, but it kind of gets to the human experience of it all. So that was my goal, to just let the story tell itself and let it unfurl and bring it to the people.
So David, since he mentioned that you approached him, why don't you talk a little bit about your role in the film?
Sure. Our third producing partner, Robert Fyvolent, had been working on this project for over 12 years. He discovered the footage through a friend of his who was working on an R&B documentary and needed some help. And his friend sort of talked about the lore of this footage that existed. And like everyone, Robert didn't really believe that happened. So, when push came to shove, Robert did a little research and discovered that a guy named Hal Tulchin had originally shot the festival in 1969, and tried to contact him, and ultimately did, and over a period of years started to gain his trust, and that's how it slowly came together. Robert and I had known each other for a while, and then I came on board as a producer, and we really wanted to figure out who would be the best person to help direct a film like this, who can contextualize the story, who can contextualize the history to the music. And really the decision was easy. It might not have been one that others might have had, but for us, Ahmir was absolutely at the top of the list, and we sought him out. And we made an appointment with him where he asked us to come to his dressing room at the Tonight Show. And well, it was the green room. And when we were in the green room, it wasn't actually the adults' green room. It was the kids' green room that was available at the time. And we showed him, some scenes from the movie. And I think, again, like everyone, at first he was sort of, shocked that this existed, and then sort of it set in where I think, it was all about, wow, how can, all of us not understand that this actually existed? How was this erased from our history? And specifically, how was it erased from Black history? And I think that was sort of the genesis on how, Ahmir came on board, and Joseph came on board immediately and worked directly with Ahmir to help contextualize sort of our story as well. And, we just put together a great team, including an editor named Josh Pearson, who is really sort of a secret weapon and happens to be a musician himself. So I think that's where it started. And, let alone it's hard enough to make a film like this. It's taken 52 years. But then, of course, we hit a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic in the middle of it, which threw a whole bunch of hurdles in our way, if you will. But, everyone sort of continued to sort of march on. And we were really blessed to have been invited to the Sundance Film Festival, where the film won both the Grand Jury Award as well as the Audience Prize. So this has been a wonderful experience, and we really just can't wait for sort of the public to be able to see this movie.
So Joseph, you'd like to talk a little bit about your involvement as a producer?
Sure. I got brought in after Ahmir was signed up as director to be sort of a creative producer and work with him on making this film. And my relationship with Ahmir starts 25 years ago. We met in 1996. I was a music journalist. My first cover story as a writer was for Rap Pages magazine. It was a big career achievement for me. And it was on The Roots. And it happened to be The Roots' first cover story as a band in America. And I was living in the Bay Area at the time. I got flown out to Philadelphia and met Ahmir, and we just clicked. He was then, as he is now, a fan at heart. He knew my byline, he knew the stories I had written. And we just, we actually hung out that whole weekend, nerding out on music. And so I've known him for a very long time. And then when I got approached with the opportunity to work on this film, I actually said no at first. I was like, there's no way Ahmir has the time to do this.
Exactly.
And I met with him also backstage at the Tonight Show, and he convinced me otherwise. He convinced me that this story was really important to him, that it was really important to tell stories like this. The kind of impact a story like this would have made on him as a kid growing up. It was important to sort of reclaim that erasure that had happened. And so, he trusted me. He said he would trust me to work with him. And that really meant a lot to me, especially after knowing him for so long. So I'm really glad he did convince me. It's been a joy and a pleasure and an honor to work on this project. And I think, first and foremost, we all set out, our whole team, to make a film that we wanted to see, that we thought should exist in the world, and that we would be happy watching. So, and I think we did that.
Yes, it sounds like a passion project for all three of you. The viewing the film, which I've seen several times now, it's incredibly dynamic film, and that partially has to do with the dynamism of the performers who come. So, setting the stage a little bit, of course, this was a festival that happened over 6 weeks in Mount Morris State Park, which is now Marcus Garvey Park in Harlem. And one of the really amazing things about that series of festivals is that it swept the range of African-American music at the time. You have gospel music, you have Max Roach on the drums, you have Sly and the Family Stone, you have Mahalia Jackson, you have Stevie Wonder, you have the Fifth Dimension. Plus, you have people who went to the shows who are, like me, older now, but were very young then, and they talk about their enthusiasm as young people, as teenagers, who were going to see all this different kind of music. How did you identify the fans? How did you find them?
I think the first signal that we threw out, I believe it came from my actual Twitter, because I figured at least with 3 million followers, someone has to have like that uncle that talked about this festival over and over again. This festival to me is like the equivalent of like believing in Santa Claus, or maybe Big Bird's relationship with Snuffleupagus. Like, did it really happen? Did it not really happen? And so I was just like, just that whole week, like, is there that one uncle or aunt figure in your life that won't shut up about this so-called festival they went to 1 billion years ago that you don't believe? Like, well, we found the footage, like, so it was sort of like that. And, we got immediate feedback. I think for us, the sweet spot for the time that we were in was sort of like finding people, I guess, who were between 14 and 20 then, which would make them 70 now. Because it's risky, because if you're kind of under the age of 10, I would think that, like, well, what insight could a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old have about, the magnitude of what they just witnessed? And, I've even had some people who were like way over 80. They were just like, hey, that was a lot of beer ago. Like, I don't remember anything. So, I think our sweet spot was finding those who were just starting to be teenagers between like 14 and 20 years old. And, once it started there, probably for me, the most compelling of those interviews was the first person that you see on the frame, Musa Jackson. Again, he was 5 years old when this happened. I barely remember like the first episode of Soul Train I ever saw, or like what I had for breakfast yesterday. So, in my mind, I think we were just quasi, skeptical, like, okay, what insight can he give us? But man, even without seeing the context of what he was getting involved with, he just literally spit it back to us what he remembers. And he said that this is his first memory in life. So it's only after the fact that we showed him the footage, and I realized slowly there, like, I really wish we would capture that moment where it's like that eureka moment for him, where it's not just him watching this footage, it's him actually getting his life back,
Mhm.
like even in my adventures in life, and like, wow, my obsession with documenting things, like writing things and writing books, mainly is because I want to preserve the memories, because I know there's going to be a time where it's like, did that happen? Didn't that happen? I don't remember that happening. And so to watch him finally receive the validation that this did happen, that's the moment where I realized, like, oh, this is much more than just this is not a vanity piece or just like, you know, a really cool art house film. This is going to give people their lives back.
Mhm.
Also, I'll jump in. The second wave of finding people was hitting the ground in Harlem. You know, beyond social media, we put boots on the ground in Harlem. We associate producer on the film, Ashley Bembry Kaintuck, you know, took a small flyer that she wrote about the festival, went to churches and community groups and met with community leaders and record stores and social clubs and let them know that we were making this film, that Ahmir was the director, and the reason why we were making this film, which I think was really important, right? A lot of people have exploited Harlem through the years. We wanted them to know the reason why we were making this film, because we thought that was really important and validating. And you know, then once you find a group of people that have been to the festival, like Ahmir said, the second thing is figuring out what they remember. And a lot of people, I'll probably say about half the people we found didn't really remember the right details because it was so long ago.
Mhm.
They were conflating things that happened maybe a year prior, a year later.
Mhm.
So the people we ended up with in the film are people that really not only remembered it, but have been cherishing these memories for decades.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think-
I would just add one other thing, and I think, you know, those memories are just an odd thing. I think that
yes,
not only
absolutely.
do people believe they remember things, but once they start getting into it, it's hard to put all of those elements together. And I think specifically in the film, you know, one of the scenes, for instance, where Marilyn McCoo and Billy Davis are watching their performance for the first time in, I think, over 50 years, it was incredibly emotional and moving, because, you know, you sort of realize life goes by very quickly. And this was a very important moment for them and for this audience. And I think those morsels of things in our film add up to so much. They're just so beautiful to watch.
Yes, the testimonies of not only the people who visited, but some of the performers. Like I remember Gladys Knight saying, we were really young and we were shocked when we got out on stage and saw all those people there, because we were just starting out and we barely knew what we were doing. That sense that you all have captured on film, this recognition, because memory is complex. You know, I do a lot of oral histories. People were, you know, memory is remembering and forgetting, and, you know, conflating and, you know, re-remembering, and having someone with you to remember, having the film to jog people's memories really is evocative. It makes the film so much more personal. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about, you said, you know, Harlem has been exploited, but you wanted to make this film to give something back to the community. If you talk a little bit more about that, that'd be great.
I don't know. I'll jump in.
I thought you meant you, Joseph.
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, for example, Cyril Bullwhip Ennis Jr. is a current Black Panther. We made the mistake of calling him a former Black Panther. He said, "No, I'm still."
I see. Yes, he remains.
Yeah, and you know, he said, "Look, people come up here all the time wanting to talk about things like why should we participate? Why should we trust you with this story?" And you know, Ashley, who I mentioned before, you know, met with him at a community board meeting on a Wednesday night, and he's like, "Look, I don't have time to talk to you. Meet me, you know, on 2 days on Friday. This is where I'll be." And she went there, and then he's like, "Oh, you know, if you want to meet more Black Panthers and more people who might have went, you have to come to this swing dancing class that I'm going to." And she went, and she went the second week, and then, you know, she put it, you know, she and she enjoyed it. Like it wasn't like, oh, I got to do this. It was really enjoyable for her, right, to connect with sort of the elders of the community.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that we got is just that people come to Harlem, and they almost wear Harlem as an aesthetic as opposed to like really being on the ground. Harlem is in '69. Harlem was the Black capital of America, and
Well, everyone in New York thinks so.
yeah, right. And when you look at our film, especially the cutaways of people in the audience, you see how much it was on the forefront stylistically and fashion. The ideas that were popping in Harlem in '69 went on to go, set the agenda for the rest of the country. So I think it was important, and it's very special for us that we're showing the film this weekend at Marcus Garvey Park, formerly Mount Morris Park, as the first New York screening, right? We got a lot of offers to show it anywhere else in the city. It was really important for us to have that first screening at Marcus Garvey.
We'll be interested to hear how that audience receives it, because of course, Harlem has changed a lot in the last 50 years, particularly in the last 10 years. And so it may bring out people who are longer term residents, or bring people back to the neighborhood that they used to live in. One of the interesting things about the film is your subtitle, when the revolution could not be televised.
Yeah.
Who would like to comment on that? Just for the audience, that refers to a song by Gil Scott-Heron that you could hear on YouTube anytime if you want.
Yeah, I'll say that of course the white elephant in the room is this film's counterpart, which was the Woodstock film.
Mhm.
And none of those acts were household names before the movie came out. So basically the movie came and somehow got held up in this sort of cultural zeitgeist where it's the most important thing ever. And chances are, especially if you weren't of the era, if you're thinking of the late '60s, I'm almost certain that Woodstock has to be in one of your first 5 memories. So the myth of Woodstock definitely has defined what our thoughts are of the '60s. And I guess in an attempt to try to find anyone interested in this footage, it was kind of we call it the working title, it was Black Woodstock, just to give a context of like, this is the Black version of it. And the thing is that, yes, that was even our working title for half a second. Well, not half a second, like during the duration of the film. But I think in the end, calling it Black Woodstock would have been like a major disservice to kind of the historical context of the Harlem Cultural Festival and what it meant to the Black community and Black artists. And, like the film actually deserves to stand alone. So I'll say that one of the last major creative moves of this film was actually christening it its own title, giving it its own proper place. So of course, Summer of Soul is the easy part, but I did want just some sort of stain or a wink, if you will, a knowing wink, which is basically, the main question that people have is, why did this footage sit for damn near 5 decades without giving its proper place in history? So that was kind of that subtitle I fought for, just so that it was a knowing wink to the story of why Black erasure seemed very easy to do.
And can someone answer the question, why did it sit for so long? Because since Hal Tulchin filmed it and apparently still had the footage, up to 10 years ago, what's the story of why it was just sitting there?
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, Hal, as I said earlier, shot this film on spec. He did it on spec. He did it with 4 cameras, a soundboard, state-of-the-art equipment at the time, and we can get into that a little later. But he believed that he was filming these seminal Black artists, in their prime, and
Mhm.
that there's a value to that somewhere along the way where he can probably be able to parlay that into a documentary or a special for television. And unfortunately, he hit roadblocks immediately.
I see.
He did cut together one special. It was a gospel one that we know of that aired once or twice in the New York area, in and around the concert itself. But after that, the film literally went to his house in Bronxville and sat in his basement for 50 years. Hal, out of frustration, coined the term Black Woodstock in order to position it to the 3 television networks, so they would have a better understanding of what this actually was, the importance of it. But, Hal, shot this 50 years ago. He passed away when he was in his early 90s. And, literally we wish he was here to sort of watch it today. But we were at the Toronto Film Festival a few years ago when Hal had an agreement that he was supposed to sign, allowing us to sort of dive into the footage. And we got a call from his wife at that point in time who shared some very bad news, who said, listen, I just want to tell you Hal passed away, which we were, obviously he was an older man. It was a very sad point in time, but without missing a beat, she turned around and said, but I just want you to know he signed the agreement. He feels that this can be part of his legacy. So
Wow.
off to the races. So the footage sat there because of really institutionalized racism. I mean, that's not a beat around the bush. No one was interested in this material.
They just couldn't see the value of it. Woodstock had overwhelmed the moment in memory, so to speak. And there wasn't space for this, or people couldn't see space for making a documentary. Well, talk a little bit, anyone watching the film experiences the really, really high quality of the sound and the very, very beautiful way in which it's shot, and the footage is really wonderful. Can you talk a little bit about Mr. Tulchin's shooting and how that came together?
Sure. As David said, he shot it on spec. He was a seasoned TV producer at the time, so he actually used 4 cameras plugged into a 2-inch videotape deck, two decks. He had 3 cameras focused on the performances happening on the stage, and 1 camera dedicated to the crowd. And 2-inch videotape in 1969 is really rare. It's a little ahead of its time, technologically speaking, but it preserves the images better than film. Most people at that time would have been shooting on 16 millimeter.
Right.
And audio-wise, we were all sort of blown away by how good the audio sounds.
Man, still blown away.
Yeah, we brought in the very experienced studio engineer, Jimmy Douglas, to do a light EQing of the material. But even when we gave him the material, he was like, this is really good for a soundboard mono feed. And because Hal was shooting on 2 decks, he had a mono feed on one and a mono feed on the other that would theoretically in the future allow someone like us to combine the tracks and make a stereo mix. Again, 5 years ahead of his time, 10 years ahead of his time. The irony, though, is that because this material sat in a basement for so long because no one wanted to make it, or no one was able to make it, is that the footage we inherited is in relatively good shape. And it allowed us to sort of, digitize this footage and restore it and put it in our film. But there is a sort of sad irony to that, right?
Yeah.
So the sad irony is that because no one wanted to make this for so long or was able to make it, that the footage was in relatively good shape. It didn't move out of the basement. And so there wasn't a lot of deterioration and degradation in the film, which is ironic, but it's a little sad.
Yes, well, in a museum we're used to that kind of thing. We have a lot of things that they can't all be out all at the same time. People say, why isn't everything out? Well, there's not enough space in the whole museum to put everything out all the time. But by not using it, it saves it for a while, and then you get to use it, later, and it looks as good as it did when it was collected in 1803. These are the kinds of things that we do in museums. So, but inadvertently, or perhaps it isn't inadvertent, I think Ahmir is really, and Joseph were really talking about the fact that the industry was not interested in this film, was not interested in this footage, wasn't so much interested in these artists, even though many of them were famous somewhat certainly Stevie Wonder and Mahalia Jackson are people who were rather famous at the time. But music was a lot more, inadvertently, music was a lot more segregated than most people realize. So when you look at the footage of Woodstock, there are a lot of Black people in America who weren't listening to that music at that time. There were a lot of Black people listening to this music, and a lot of other people were listening to this music at that time. But these different audiences didn't necessarily cross. And the studio executives, I guess, thought that Woodstock had sealed the moment, as if that was all there was to say about that moment. But actually, what's going on in African American culture is crucial to understanding the moment we're in right now, that derives in part from these moments. For example, they talk about in the film the fact that Reverend Martin Luther King had been killed the year before, in 1968, as well as Robert F. Kennedy was killed the year before, and some footage that refers to that is in the film. So it sets a little bit of the stage that there were tremendous riots, actually in more than 200 cities across the United States in 1968. And in 1969, there are subsequent riots happening across the United States. But in New York, there was only a very small amount of rioting by comparison to some other cities in 1968. And the implication is that the city of New York wanted to have something that perhaps would create a cooler summer. And people make some reference to that in the film. Mayor Lindsay, who was a liberal Republican mayor at the time. I don't know if there are liberal Republicans in our nation much anymore, but there were.
Democrats now.
There were in 1969. And he was a mayor, and he supported Tony Lawrence, who was the impresario for the film. I don't know if one of you would like to talk about Tony Lawrence, who is obviously was a very persuasive man, and a man who could really organize something, but doesn't have the same name recognition as someone like Don Cornelius from Soul Train. What can you tell us about Tony Lawrence?
But I was going to say that, the underlying unspoken sort of bottom line here is the fact that for the longest, our contributions and our culture has been somewhat seen as disposable, which, be it major or minor. I mean, we even have those battles today. I mean, today you have on social media content creators on TikTok that are now speaking out against like certain dances they create or whatnot that get stolen, and just, that's always sort of been the history of Black creators. And the idea of how our culture can be utilized and sort of discarded without even a second thought. As far as the film was concerned, I'm sure that a big part of the green lighting was due to the fact that they didn't want a repeat of what happened in 1968 with the riots. So knowing that the next year was coming up and how much property damage happened in 1968, the idea of the festival was sort of to keep people's minds occupied to protect the property of Harlem. And once that was achieved, it was sort of like, okay, that's it. So it's almost like that was, I believe, the main reason for why this got even greenlit in the first place to even happen. The story of Tony Lawrence, however, Tony was kind of my North Star, because I think even as a first-time director, with any new embarkment I have, be it like working with someone who's not my group, leaving the life I've known for 20 years to do late night television, to do other mediums like write about food or something that's not just directly about drumming. There's oftentimes the voices of doubt set in your head, or you just feel like, I can't do this. And I really love the fact that Tony Lawrence, even back then, had a kind of a chip in his head that wouldn't allow that voice to get louder than his actual execution and his achievement. Today, we would just call that hustling. But just from the
Even then they called it hustling.
well, yeah, even then, but hustling sort of has a negative connotation, like you're robbing Peter to pay Paul and that sort of thing. You're shisty. But what it really is doing is it's manifesting a dream and manifesting your destiny and making it's bigger than you are, So even for me, with the doubt of even executing this, at the end of the day, I was like, yo, this is way bigger than, like, I'm trying to manage this sort of like creating a record and make sure I get a good record review. But no, this is telling history, and this is like Joseph said, this is giving people their history back. And I just love the fact I know that Obama's first book was, The Audacity to Dream. And for me, that's what Tony Lawrence embodied, the sheer audacity, even by his outfit choices and whatnot. Like,
Yes, right.
he literally, there was no fear. There was absolute confidence in it. And so, I'm certain that most people just say, yes, he was a hustler. He had to lie to this person and get to that person. But no, it's like he had a dream and he manifested it. And, he's now my spirit animal. So I think the personal lesson that I learned in doing this is really not having a fear chip anymore that I used to have. I might move in slowly. Like, I just don't want to jump in a lake of piranha and like, the water's cold. I'm dying, But for me, to see him fearlessly have a vision and see it through. And yes, even his vision of getting this nationwide came true, be it 50 years later. So yes, he manifested a dream, and come July 2nd, that dream finally came to fruition. So, for me, that's what Tony Lawrence represents to me.
Do we know what happened to him later? I've tried to do some research on that and I couldn't find anything.
We still got some time.
Yeah, I was going to say, if we happen to find him right now, would we stop all production right now just to add him in the film? Yeah, I was going to say that the one level of no stone unturned that just sort of came up empty. I mean, it was even to the point where, my girlfriend's mother used to work for the government, and I had her like looking up everything, and no, his name was too common to even try to find. Yeah. So no, there's no sign of Tony Lawrence.
Yeah, that's hopefully by having more people seeing the film, maybe praying. Someone who knew Tony Lawrence will come out of the woodwork and contact you all. That
I'm praying for
really
it.
Great.
I'm praying for it. Yes.
Yeah, that would be really great, because your conversation about cultural, not just appropriation, but cultural
erasure.
Yeah, it is a long story, a big story. Sometimes I've heard people say a lot of Americans like Black culture, but they don't like Black people. So if you can have the songs, but somehow not have the people who produce the songs, isn't that great? So I think resisting, one of the things I would say in watching the film and living through that era is that even though the motivation of the city may have been to keep Harlem calm during the summer. The exuberance of the performances and the energy and excitement of the audience completely, it's like it throws that out. It becomes a moment, a real cultural moment in African-American history and in American history, to be in that moment and that music and the audience and seeing what they're wearing and seeing some people are dancing and other people are, sort of awestruck, and other people are tending their children and talking about people selling food on the sides. It really embodies a whole cultural moment. It's not just what you see on stage.
A pacifier, right? Yeah.
Yes,
You're
it's
right.
the
You're totally right.
connection between those people watching and those people performing who are in an experience together.
Unfortunately, I feel as though, what I've always said, which we didn't quite mention in the film, because I don't think you have to down something to lift something else up.
Right.
Which is so typically American. Like, okay, I'm gonna down that just to lift up my thing. But, I still stand by it that if even 10% of the things that happened at the Woodstock Festival happened at the Harlem Cultural, if one thing that happened at that festival, then you probably would have heard of the Harlem Cultural Festival, but just under a whole nother light. I mean, it would have probably been what Altamont represents for the Rolling Stones. I'm almost certain that that's what happened. So, the fact that, 300,000 people got to witness this incident free, no crashing in the gates, no over drug uses, no mud fights or whatever. I will say that, yes, if even 3 things happened at Woodstock happened at this festival, then you probably would have heard it, which is unfortunate that if it were negative, then we would have known about it.
Can I just add to one of my favorite things about the film, and I've seen it hundreds of times already, is when you're watching the performances and the side camera where you see like Sly and the Family Stone performing, if you look at the crowd in the background, it extends forever. It's thousands and thousands of people up the rock in the park.
Right.
The angle of the crowd is just a full park. The camera that shows the stage, what I love looking at is all the kids running around in the back behind the park. And it just, I think I've thought sometimes like what it would have been like to be in that crowd.
Yeah.
Just be surrounded by your community. What a special feeling that must have been.
In fact, a couple of the people who were participants tell you that. They say that in the film. They say, it was like going to the best barbecue ever or something. That it was just so much fun and so much community of people there. Although some of the teenagers, one woman actually says, that was the summer I got free of my parents and I could do what I wanted. And I identified with that because that summer I was actually 15. So I was like, wow, yes, that's the summer I got free of my parents. And I could go to concerts and I could go to movies that I wanted to go to. So I understood that feeling of freedom. And that's something you see in the audience. People feel free to be themselves.
Yeah.
I would also add, from the performers' side, it was the first time for many of these performers to play for a predominantly Black audience.
For some of those people, yeah, absolutely.
At that size.
Yeah, and
the Fifth Dimension talk about that very specifically.
Yeah. That's one of the first things that we immediately noticed. Because I'm pretty much familiar with all the artists that performed at the festival, so I kind of know what their performance style was like. But when it came to the Fifth Dimension, I'd never heard Billy Davis kind of go into his gospel preacher growl thing, which the last time I heard kind of a code switching level of in entertainment, at least of that magnitude, was, the infamous double Sam Cooke album set, in which one was clearly like a upscale kind of dinner show, which
Yeah.
he's doing his Sinatra thing.
Yeah.
And then the one that he does in Miami, which is like, sort of a down home, rebel rousing gospel performance using a whole nother voice I never heard of before. And, the thing is that that's something that I immediately related to, which is why I felt kind of compelled to ask Merlin McCoo and Billy about their positioning in entertainment, because, technically by the numbers, they were the biggest act at that festival. They had the #1 pop single in America at that moment.
Right.
And, in terms of having to code switch, that's something that I'm really familiar with, because, some days it's like the Roots are going to open up for System of a Down. And the next week we're going to open for Wu-Tang Clan. And then the next week, we're opening for Beck. And then the next week we're with Lauryn Hill. So it's, and there's totally two different audiences. And, it was, for me, it was my moment to actually connect with somebody that, that I didn't feel alone in this world. Like I kind of felt like, oh man, like, am I the only one that has to do this? Like sort of switch sides and, readjust myself so that I can make the audience feel comfortable and that sort of thing. And so I knew that kind of had to been exhausting, because just the way that they were performing, it was like their life depended on it. Like they look so happy on stage, as opposed to, like with acts, they had to be polished and, cross every T and dot every I and that sort of thing. And I noticed that just with this performance, they were happy and dancing and that sort of thing. And the emotional floodgates opened, and I knew that that was a familiar feeling that I felt. So that's why I felt the need to ask Billy and Marilyn about that part of their lives, and they immediately related to it.
Yeah, it was also very fascinating to hear how they put the song from Hair, Aquarius, with Let the Sun Shine In, because I'd always wondered, how did that happen? Why did that happen?
We're also music geeks as well. So even in telling history, like, I wanted to, at least for the music geek in me, wanted to know about choreography and was there a writer, and how did this song come to be. So there was a lot to unpack in this film. Like our first cut was definitely like 3 hours and some change. So probably one of the biggest heartbreaks was trying to really edit down a tight 2 hours. But this could have easily slipped into 4.5 hour territory if you allowed this to.
Yes, no, it's and some people, I'd be one of them. I'd sign up to listen to 4 hours worth of this. We're coming close to the end of our time. I did want to mention something really interesting, I thought, on stage when Mavis Staple talked about singing with Mahalia Jackson. That was extremely poignant, because Mavis is young. She's a young singer at that time, and they were known to Black audiences, but they're probably at the beginning of getting of greater fame as they're moving somewhat away from singing religious music to beginning to sing more popular music. But to be there with Mahalia Jackson, who wasn't on the charts, but had been, essentially a star, the most important gospel singer in the United States during her lifetime, and is, coming to the end. She's a mature woman at that point, and she's coming to the end. And when Mavis Staples says, she leaned over and said, I'm not feeling so well. Can you help me sing this song? And then you sing that song together. That was and Precious Lord.
Yeah, that was a beautiful passing.
Song.
It was a beautiful
King's funeral.
Yeah, it was a beautiful passing of the torch, and I also felt that was important to be seen, because oftentimes you don't see today, you rarely see today, and I really wanted to dispel the myth. I wanted to dispel the myth that that people can't work together. I mean, because oftentimes if you look out throughout music history, like it took so long for like Mariah and Whitney to do a song together. You know, it took 2 decades for Mary J. Blige and Shaka Khan. So, you know, it's almost rare to see people at the top of their creative craft sharing the moment, not trying to upstage each other, but really sharing that moment with each other. Yeah, to me, that to me was one of the most heart-stopping moments ever in the film, and important to see. You know, not just collaborating because this person has an audience that I want to capture,
Right.
but really you see the love and the admiration, and you literally see the passing of the torch. And you know, that's one thing I would like to see more of. I think the diversity of how this thing was curated in '69, where you can have free jazz, gospel, African, Latin, pop, soul, blues, all those things amalgamated, you know, for an event, and people be open to it. And, you know, today it's sadly less of that. And I felt it was important to show that passing of the torch moment, to plant a seed, hopefully, that, you know, that will happen today and continue to happen now that this film has been preserved and in history's right place.
Well, that's it. That's a great place. That's a great place to stop. We are pretty much out of time. I want to thank all three of you, David Dinerstein, Joseph Patel, and of course, Ahmir Questlove Thompson, for being here and for sharing your experience with this extraordinary film. July 2nd, if you're going to be at Marcus Garvey Park, you'll be able to see it on July 2nd. But if not, it's coming to theaters near you, right?
Yes, it is. Yes, absolutely.
Marcus Garvey Park this weekend.
Yes.
July 2nd, in theaters.
In theaters, drive-ins, and Hulu. Yes.
Okay. This weekend in Marcus Garvey Park.
Yes, on Juneteenth. Yes, absolutely.
On Juneteenth.
Yes.
Okay.
How
But
apropos.
July 2nd around the country.
Yes.
Thank you again. Marvelous film. Marvelous film.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Faith.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.